Here's your implausible, wild story of coincidences, among other things. There's a great movie called Argo, and it is a Ben Affleck movie based on the true story of the escape of a number of American hostages from Iran after the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979 with the fall of the Shah. The Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran storms into the American embassy and takes captive a lot of Americans. Some of them are able to escape. That is what the movie is about. Others, not so lucky. And through a series of protracted negotiations, Iran released the hostages on January 20th, 1981. As Ronald Reagan was being sworn in to be president of the United States, the hostages were being released. Democrats suspected that there might have been a plot because there was a man named Gary Sick. Gary Sick was a national security aide to Jimmy Carter in the White House. And Gary Sick started believing in his head that what had transpired was a plot by the incoming Reagan team during the campaign, while they were campaigning, to convince the Iranians not to do a hostage deal with Jimmy Carter. And under the theory, American arms would be delivered to Iran via Israel if the hostages weren't released until Jimmy Carter lost. Now, fast forward to 1984, and it is now documented history that Ted Kennedy tried to get the Soviets to interfere in the 1984 election against Ronald Reagan and tried to get them to cut deals to calm tensions to help Walter Mondale. But this 1980 deal, Gary Sick started talking about it, and in 1992, George H.W. Bush was running for re-election against Bill Clinton, and the Democrats decided they needed to investigate it. Why? Because a kook in a prison, a felon incarcerated, claimed to have direct knowledge that George H.W. Bush, who in a past life had not just been the ambassador to China and the chairman of the Republican National Committee, but had also been the director of the CIA. And this guy claimed that George H.W. Bush did a secret mission to Spain on board an SR71 Blackbird, the fastest plane ever made, and was secretly able to get to Spain and back in a matter of hours because of the speed of that plane, so no one noticed he was off the campaign trail. And he conducted secret negotiations with the Iranians to get the hostages out, but not until Jimmy Carter lost. And in 1992, the Democrats in Congress decided they had to investigate. They had to investigate. Do you know one of the Democrats who thought this could be possibly true? It was a man in the United States Senate named Joseph Robinette Biden. And Joe Biden was one of the Democrats convinced it at least needed to be investigated to see if Ronald Reagan, through George H.W. Bush, through a covert mission on an SR-71 Blackbird to Spain, was able to negotiate with the mullahs of Iran to keep Americans held hostage longer as a way to undermine Jimmy Carter. Because God forbid those hostages be released before Reagan got elected. It could have thrown the election. Now, for all of you Democrats who want to lecture Republicans on QAnon or the stolen election or all this other stuff, you people literally had your members of Congress in 1992 decide to investigate George H.W. Bush and whether he took an SR71 Blackbird to Spain in 1980 to sabotage a hostage deal to undermine Jimmy Carter. This is real. This is documented. This is actual history. The Democrats so believed it, they held a congressional inquiry to see if it was true. Now, notably, H. Ross Perot, remember him? Maybe you don't. And when he ran in 1992, he hired a private investigator who went to meet the man in prison who claimed the conspiracy theory. The man realized, or Perot rather, realized that this couldn't be true because the man who claimed deep involvement in the SR71 plot couldn't tell you how to turn it on. This is how wild the Democratic conspiracies got. And Joe Biden was one of those conspiracy theorists who was willing to examine, in the height of a political season, whether or not this was the case. More legitimate has come out about Hunter Biden that was not a conspiracy than ever came out about George H.W. Bush and this plot to supposedly go to Spain or Paris or wherever it was. Now, it's not a coincidence, I don't think, that Joe Biden realizes if he can get the Hamas hostages released this week, he might be able to help Kamala Harris, bringing the war to an end in Israel, all to help Kamala Harris. Anthony Blinken is over there now doing the negotiations.
Mr. President, thank you very much. It's always good to be with you and good to be back in Israel. This is my 9th visit since October 7th to Israel, to the Middle East. And this is a decisive moment. Probably the best, maybe the last opportunity to get the hostages home, to get a ceasefire, and to put everyone on a better path to enduring peace and security. I'm here as part of an intensive diplomatic effort on President Biden's instructions to try to get this agreement to the line and ultimately over the line. It is time for it to get done. It's also time to make sure that no one takes any steps that could derail this process. And so we're working to make sure that there is no escalation, that there are no provocations, that there are no actions that in any way could move us away from getting this deal over the line, or, for that matter, escalating the conflict to other places and to greater intensity. I know this is a fraught moment in Israel, with deep concern about the possibility of attacks coming from Iran, coming from Hezbollah, and other sources. And as you heard the President say, the United States has taken decisive action to deploy forces here to deter any attacks and, if necessary, to defend against any attacks. But the focus of my visit is intensely on getting the hostages back, getting the ceasefire done. It is time for everyone to get to yes and to not look for any excuses to say no. I look forward to the day ahead, seeing the Prime Minister, Defense Minister, other senior officials. But it's always a pleasure to start the day with you.
That was Anthony Blinken standing there with Israel's president. The White House is grumbling that Benjamin Netanyahu is scuttling the plan. Benjamin Netanyahu says he's not going to negotiate against himself, that Hamas refuses further negotiations. Hamas keeps demanding further concessions from Israel that Israel's not going to give. I personally wonder if the hostages are still alive. It's been a while since we've had any proof of life of the hostages. Been quite a while. But I don't think it's a coincidence that Biden is escalating pressure on Israel in particular to try to get a deal done this week during the Democratic National Convention, because Joe Biden, back in 1980, bought into this theory advanced by members of Jimmy Carter's national security team that George H.W. Bush had scuttled the Iranian hostage deal to help Ronald Reagan get elected. The more precise theory of it was that Bill Casey, who would become the CIA director for Ronald Reagan, Democrats claimed he had gone to Madrid to negotiate all this stuff with the Iranians to forestall the departure of the hostages until Reagan's inaugural, and that George H.W. Bush then took the SR71 Blackbird to Paris to conclude the deals. Now, there were problems with this. Casey said he hadn't left the country. Turns out he had gone to London for a couple of days, And Democrats were like, oh, that was just a cover. He was actually in Madrid, except he was seen in London and then going back to the United States. It was all a wild story. But one of the people willing to buy into the theory was Joe Biden. People shouldn't forget Joe Biden was willing to consider the theory because it was advanced by someone who was on Jimmy Carter's security team. And he still has a close affinity with Jimmy Carter. So I don't think it's a coincidence at all that we're seeing an escalation in the push towards release of the hostages this week during the Democratic National Committee, because so much of what Joe Biden does, you will recall, is trying to be in defense of and revise the record of Jimmy Carter. Joe Biden is the only American president in the last 30, 40 years who actually cares for Jimmy Carter. The others, Democrat and Republican alike, not big fans of Jimmy Carter as a president. Joe Biden mirrors himself after Jimmy Carter. It's one reason we have the economy we have today. It's a perfect mirror to Jimmy Carter. It's also why Joe Biden wants these hostages out as quickly as possible so he can revise and extend his record, be the guy who did it, and if he can do it this week, he can be convinced it will help Kamala Harris. But here's the part you must not take away from this. It is now August 19th, 2024. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas took Americans hostage. A good president of the United States would not have taken almost a year for them to be released, nor to have escalated the pressure during the Democratic National Convention or the Republican National Convention for just a good PR blitz. A good American president would have made sure no Americans were taken hostage, and if they were expeditiously released. The fact that there are Americans held hostage by Hamas now, all this time later, is actually a damning indictment on Joe Biden's record as president. The failures of Afghanistan and the failures with getting American hostages released in Israel will be the bookends of this man's presidency. Bob Gates, who is the Secretary of Defense for George W. Bush and for Barack Obama, said Joe Biden has been wrong about every major foreign policy issue for 50 years. This is just another one. And that he would do this week for a PR blitz for the Democrats just shows you how craven his politics are. And yes, I absolutely think the escalating pressure this week has everything to do with trying to get it done so it can be announced to help Kamala Harris. Everything these people do is political, including getting hostages released.